They called it the Night of Silk and Stone, not for beauty, but for what the Bosphorus revealed at dawn: silk nightgowns twisted around sacks of stone, jewellery catching the faint moonlight, and the lifeless bodies of 280 women who once laughed, dreamed and hoped until the moment they caught a madman's eye. But this story doesn't begin with death, it begins with a mother's love. In the 1640s, at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, Gruesome Sultan, the most powerful woman in the world, walked the slave markets of Istanbul. She wasn't there for herself, she was there for her son, choosing the most beautiful girl she could find, believing she was protecting him from the madness in their bloodline. She couldn't know she was handing them over to an absolute monster. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about power with sheer madness, and what really happens when a broken mind is given dominion over human lives. Because Sultan Ibrahim wasn't born evil. He was created piece by piece in a golden cage designed to preserve the great Ottoman dynasty, and the women who paid the price, unfortunately, never saw it coming. It all started with a nightmare 25 years earlier in a room that would make you feel absolute disgust to be born in this family. In 1615, Ibrahim, the 8-year-old boy, watches through the golden bars the proclamation of his brother Osman as the Sultan. What this child doesn't understand yet is, he's just entered a prison. He thinks the beautiful room with its silk cushions and jewelled walls is a reward of his privilege. What he doesn't know is that he'll never see the door open again unless it is to drag out his corpse. This was cafes, the cage system. It was the Ottoman solution to royal succession, evolving from committing outright fratricide to something far more insidious, creating psychological torture disguised as luxury. This system would keep the spare heirs alive but powerless, confine them behind the golden walls with no access to the outside world, ready to rule if needed, but broken enough never to threaten the current sultan. For 25 years, Ibrahim lived in that golden box. He watched his brothers disappear one by one, not to natural death, but to the executioner's silk cord. Osman II, strangled by rebellious soldiers in 1622. Uncle Mustafa I, driven mad by confinement and deposed twice. By 1640, when Sultan Murad IV lay dying of liver disease, only Ibrahim remained. But this is where we understand everything about what those years of confinement had done to his mind. When palace officials came to release Ibrahim and proclaim him Sultan, he barricaded himself inside the cage. 25 years of imprisonment had taught him that every knock on the door might be death. He screamed that it was a trick, that his brother was testing him, that they were lying about Murad's death. They had to drag Murad's rotting corpse to the cage door to convince Ibrahim he was finally free. The man who emerged was broken in ways that wouldn't become apparent for years. At first, Ibrahim seemed almost normal. He met with his Grand Vizier, showed interest in state affairs, even disguised himself to walk among his people in Istanbul's markets. Those who knew him noticed troubling signs: the constant headaches, the violent mood swings, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. But these seemed manageable quirks, not harbingers of horror. His mother, Gruesome Sultan, had ruled the empire from behind the scenes for decades. She'd seen what the cafe system could do to the male members of the Ottoman dynasty, so she made a decision that seemed logical, even compassionate at the time. She would distract her damaged son with the one thing that might keep him occupied and harmless: women. Gruesome personally scoured Istanbul's slave markets. She selected Circassian girls with pale skin and golden hair, Georgian beauties with dark eyes and graceful movements, Russian captives taken in border raids. She filled Ibrahim's harem with hundreds of women, creating what she thought would be a harmless playground for her psychologically fragile son. She had no idea she was stocking a slaughterhouse. At first, Ibrahim's behaviour seemed merely excessive. He kept over 300 concubines, far more than most sultans, but not unprecedented. He spent enormous sums on perfumes, silks, and jewellery for his women. The imperial treasury, once overflowing with the wealth of 3 continents, began to empty as Ibrahim indulged every whim. But it was his specific obsessions that revealed the true depth of his psychological damage. Ibrahim had developed a fixation with large women, not just curvy, enormous. He sent agents across the empire with golden casts of a cow's hindquarters, ordering them to find women whose bodies matched the mould exactly. They found what he was looking for in Armenia. Shiveka Sultan, weighing over 300 pounds, became Ibrahim's absolute favourite. He showered her with gifts that bankrupted provinces, made her the second most powerful woman in the empire after his mother, and spent hours simply staring at her massive form. But Shiveka's influence would prove catastrophic because she understood exactly how to manipulate Ibrahim's paranoid, fractured mind. Now, let me paint you the real picture of what life was like inside Ibrahim's harem, because the romanticized image of Ottoman harems as luxurious pleasure palaces is a fantasy that ignores a brutal truth. These women were slaves. Captured in raids, purchased in markets, or given as tribute, they had no choice in their fate. Yes, they were educated, taught Turkish, music, poetry, and the arts of seduction. But they were also prisoners, locked behind walls they could never cross, competing desperately for the attention of a man who held their lives in his trembling hands. And Ibrahim's attention was disturbing. Ibrahim had developed elaborate sexual rituals that showcased his complete detachment from reality. He would order his concubines to strip naked in the palace gardens, then run among them making horse noises, convinced he was a stallion among mares. He forced them to kick and struggle against him, recreating some twisted fantasy of conquest and submission. But it was his relationship with violence that truly revealed the monster the cafes had created. Ibrahim couldn't separate pleasure from pain, love from domination, desire from destruction. The same hands that caressed his favourites would, without warning, turn violent. He once grabbed his own infant son, cut the boy with a knife and threw him into a pool. Only a servant's quick action saved the future Sultan Mehmed IV from drowning. The women of the harem lived in constant, suffocating terror. They never knew which Ibrahim would appear, the generous sultan who gave away entire treasuries, or the madman who might strangle them for imagined slights. Some tried to resist. One concubine actually pulled a dagger on Ibrahim when he attempted to force himself on her. His mother intervened, allowing the woman to escape, but such defiance was rare and dangerous. Most simply endured, hoping to survive long enough to bear a son and gain some protection through motherhood. But in 1647, even that fragile hope would be shattered by a whispered lie. The crisis began with Shiveka Sultan's poisoned tongue. She approached Ibrahim with a devastating claim. One of his concubines had been compromised by an outsider. Someone had violated the sanctity of his harem, she whispered. Someone had defiled what belonged to him. For a man already consumed by paranoia, already broken by decades of isolation and betrayal, this was the ultimate violation. Ibrahim's reaction was swift and brutal. He ordered investigations, interrogations, torture sessions that echoed through the palace corridors, but no amount of questioning revealed the identity of this mysterious intruder, because of course there was no intruder. Shiveka had invented the entire story, possibly to eliminate rivals, to watch the chaos unfold, or simply because she could. But Ibrahim's mind, already fractured beyond repair, couldn't accept that the threat wasn't real. If he couldn't find the guilty party, then everyone was potentially guilty. If one woman had betrayed him, then all women might betray him. The logic of madness is always perfect in its own twisted way. And so, on a cold night in 1647, Ibrahim made a decision that would shock even the violence-hardened Ottoman court. He ordered every woman in his harem, all 280 of them, to be tied in weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. It is gruesome to even imagine these women who had shared his bed, borne his children, competed for his favour, suddenly dragged from their chambers by stone-faced palace guards. Some begged for mercy in languages Ibrahim had taught them to speak. Others maintained their dignity to the end, facing death with the same grace they'd shown in life. A few tried to run, but where could they go in a palace surrounded by water on three sides? The executions took hours. One by one, the women were bound with silk cords, weighted with stones, and hurled from the palace walls into the dark waters below. The Bosphorus, that narrow strait connecting Europe and Asia, became a mass grave for Ibrahim's paranoid rage. But here's the detail that transforms this from mere historical atrocity to brutal slaughter. Ibrahim didn't just order the killings and retreat to his chambers, he watched. He observed the executions from his palace windows, perhaps even taking pleasure in the sight of his former favourites disappearing beneath the waves. The screams carried across the water. Palace servants later testified they could hear the women calling out names of children they'd left behind, of families they'd been stolen from, of gods they prayed would receive their souls. But Ibrahim watched it all with the same detached fascination he'd once shown while admiring Shivakar's massive form. Only one woman survived that night. A French merchant ship happened to be passing as the executions began. French sailors, horrified by what they witnessed, managed to rescue a single concubine from the water. They took her back to Paris, where she lived to tell the tale of that terrible night. Her testimony, preserved in French diplomatic records, provides the only eyewitness account of Ibrahim's greatest atrocity. The massacre of the Harem marked the beginning of the end for Ibrahim's reign. The Ottoman Empire was already straining under his misrule. The disastrous war with Venice had drained the treasury. His extravagant spending had bankrupted provinces, but the murder of 280 innocent women was too much even for a court accustomed to royal excess. Whispers began in the palace corridors. The janissaries, the empire's elite troops, started meeting in secret. Even Ibrahim's own mother, Gruesome Sultan, began to turn against the son she had tried so desperately to protect. She'd created this monster by attempting to save him, and now she realised he had to be stopped. The end came swiftly. In August 1648, the janissaries revolted. They stormed the palace, demanding Ibrahim's abdication. When he refused, they simply deposed him, installing his 6-year-old son Mehmed IV as the new sultan. Ibrahim was thrown back into a cage, the same type of golden prison where his madness had been born. For 10 days, his screams echoed through the palace as he realised his fate. The boy who had once been too afraid to leave his cage was now too terrified to stay in it. On August 18, 1648, the executioners came. Ibrahim's final words were a desperate plea that revealed he still didn't understand what he'd become. But there was no mercy. The man who had shown none would receive none. Ibrahim was strangled with a silk cord, the same method used to bind the women he had murdered. Yet even in death, Ibrahim's story raises questions that historians still debate. Was he truly mad, or was he the inevitable product of a system designed to break human minds? The Cafes had created other damaged sultans, but none quite like Ibrahim. But here is what was truly haunting. It was not the madness of one man, but the 280 women who paid for it. They weren't faceless. They had names, hopes, fears. They were humans. Some were stolen as children, others sold by starving families, a few lured by promises of palace life, and all of them died because a sultan's paranoia demanded it. So was Ibrahim a victim of the cage that shaped him, or simply a monster hiding behind trauma? Tell me your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more of history's darkest untold chapters, make sure you subscribe.